In the dead of winter, in the year 304 AD, a child walked willingly into the jaws of death. Not a soldier, not a rebel, but a girl of just 13 years old. Her name was Eulalia. The marble streets of Emerita Augusta, a thriving Roman city in what is now Spain, had seen countless executions before. But nothing like this. Nothing so young. Nothing so defiant. As dawn broke, she stood before the governor's tribunal, her voice ringing out against the empire that ruled the known world. She mocked its gods, defied its emperor, and in doing so, signed her own death warrant. For the Romans, she was a criminal. For her fellow Christians, she would become a saint. And for history, she remains a haunting question: what would drive a child to seek her own execution, and what does it say about an empire that chose to kill her? This is not simply a story about faith, nor just about persecution. It is about the clash between innocence and power, between the fragile body of a child and the full weight of an empire. A story that begins with fire and ends with snow. A story that outlived emperors, toppled gods, and helped shape the world we live in today. This is the story of 13 flames for 13 years, the martyrdom of Eulalia. The winter of 304 AD was harsh in the western provinces of the Roman Empire. In the city of Emerita Augusta, today's Mérida in Spain, the air hung heavy with smoke from hearths, and the marble streets, worn smooth by centuries of marching legions, gleamed under the pale light of dawn. This city, founded by Augustus for his veterans, had witnessed triumphal parades, gladiatorial spectacles, and countless executions. Yet on that cold December morning, the footsteps echoing across its forum did not belong to a soldier or a criminal. They belonged to a child. Her name was Eulalia, and she was 13 years old. Those who saw her that morning might have struggled to understand what was happening. She was slight of build, barely taller than the shields of the soldiers who flanked the tribunal. She wore no ornaments, no protective cloak against the chill, only a plain wool tunic, the garb of an ordinary girl. Yet there was nothing ordinary in the way she carried herself. Each step was deliberate, as though she were walking toward a destiny she had already accepted. The Romans had seen many kinds of defiance before: rebel generals, deserting soldiers, zealots from Judea who hurled curses before their crucifixion. But never a child. The crowd that gathered at the forum murmured in disbelief. What could bring a girl of her age here, not dragged in chains, but walking of her own free will? To answer that, one must look at the storm consuming the empire. By the dawn of the 4th century, Rome was an empire of contradictions. Its armies still controlled vast territories, stretching from the sands of Africa to the forests of Britain. Its cities still boasted aqueducts, theaters, and marketplaces teeming with life. But beneath this veneer of grandeur, cracks were spreading. Barbarian raids pressed against the frontiers. Inflation gnawed at the economy. Civil wars flared as rival generals proclaimed themselves emperors. Amid this turmoil rose Diocletian, a soldier of humble birth who seized power and ruled with iron determination. To him, the empire's troubles were not merely political or military. They were spiritual. Rome, he believed, had angered the gods who had once favored it. The growing presence of Christians, those who refused to sacrifice to Jupiter or acknowledge the divine genius of the emperor, was, in his eyes, a direct assault on the very foundation of Roman greatness. On February 24, 303 AD, Diocletian struck back. His edict demanded the destruction of churches, the burning of sacred texts, and the arrest of Christian leaders. Every citizen was required to prove loyalty to Rome's gods through sacrifice. Certificates of compliance were issued. Refusal meant loss of property, exile, imprisonment, or death. Emerita Augusta, capital of Lusitania, was not spared. The city's governor, Dacian, enforced the edict with cold efficiency. Altars were erected in public squares. Citizens lined up to offer incense to the gods. Soldiers carried orders to dismantle house churches, and informants prowled the streets, ready to denounce neighbors. Some Christians fled to the countryside, others quietly conformed while holding their faith in secret. And some, a small and stubborn few, prepared to face martyrdom. Among those who watched this unfold was a girl being raised in privilege but also in danger. Eulalia's family was part of the city's elite. Their villa stood among vineyards and olive groves. Outwardly, they conformed to Roman customs, but within their household, the forbidden texts of Christianity were read in hushed voices by lamplight. To protect themselves, her parents taught her both the classics of Homer and Virgil and the Gospels of Christ. From this dual education emerged a child who was as fluent in poetry as she was in prayer, and who seemed destined to challenge the world around her. Even as a child, Eulalia displayed a fierce spirit. When her peers joined festivals honoring Roman gods, she refused. When teachers invoked Jupiter or Mars, she openly mocked them. Warnings fell on deaf ears. For her, faith was not to be hidden but declared. Her parents grew increasingly alarmed. To them, discretion was survival, to her, silence was betrayal. So when Diocletian's edict arrived, the family made a choice. They withdrew to their countryside villa, hoping time and distance would shield their daughter from danger. Surrounded by vineyards, far from the city's watchful eyes, Eulalia could live quietly until the storm passed. But for Eulalia, retreat was not safety, it was cowardice. In her young mind, every moment of comfort in hiding was an abandonment of those who were suffering and dying in the city. The sources say she prayed for days, wrestling with a decision incomprehensible to modern sensibilities, whether to deliberately place herself in the hands of those who would kill her. She fasted, she sang psalms, she demanded of God the strength to confront Rome itself. Then, one night in December, while her household slept, she made her choice. With only a single companion, tradition names her as Julia, perhaps a servant or a fellow believer, she slipped away. The two girls walked for miles through the darkness, their breath visible in the winter air, their sandals striking the frozen ground. By the time the sun rose, they had reached the gates of Emerita Augusta. The city's forum loomed ahead, its columns and temples bathed in pale light. Merchants opened their stalls. Soldiers patrolled with spears in hand. Ordinary citizens went about their business, unaware that history was about to be written in their midst. Into this stage walked Eulalia. What happened next would astonish those who witnessed it, and echo through centuries. She did not wait to be summoned. She did not hide in shadows. She walked straight into the heart of Roman authority, a child facing an empire, her voice prepared to challenge gods and emperor alike. And as she stepped forward, the people whispered. Some laughed, some frowned, but all turned their eyes toward her. 13 years old. 13 steps across the marble stones. And a fire already burning within her that no imperial edict could extinguish. The winter of 304 AD was harsh in the western provinces of the Roman Empire. In the city of Emerita Augusta, today's Mérida in Spain, the air hung heavy with smoke from hearths, and the marble streets, worn smooth by centuries of marching legions, gleamed under the pale light of dawn. This city, founded by Augustus for his veterans, had witnessed triumphal parades, gladiatorial spectacles, and countless executions. Yet on that cold December morning, the footsteps echoing across its forum did not belong to a soldier or a criminal. They belonged to a child. Her name was Eulalia, and she was 13 years old. Those who saw her that morning might have struggled to understand what was happening. She was slight of build, barely taller than the shields of the soldiers who flanked the tribunal. She wore no ornaments, no protective cloak against the chill, only a plain wool tunic, the garb of an ordinary girl. Yet there was nothing ordinary in the way she carried herself. Each step was deliberate, as though she were walking toward a destiny she had already accepted. The Romans had seen many kinds of defiance before, rebel generals, deserting soldiers, zealots from Judea who hurled curses before their crucifixion. But never a child. The crowd that gathered at the forum murmured in disbelief. What could bring a girl of her age here, not dragged in chains, but walking of her own free will? To answer that, one must look at the storm consuming the empire. By the dawn of the 4th century, Rome was an empire of contradictions. Its armies still controlled vast territories, stretching from the sands of Africa to the forests of Britain. Its cities still boasted aqueducts, theaters, and marketplaces teeming with life. But beneath this veneer of grandeur, cracks were spreading. Barbarian raids pressed against the frontiers. Inflation gnawed at the economy. Civil wars flared as rival generals proclaimed themselves emperors. Amid this turmoil rose Diocletian, a soldier of humble birth who seized power and ruled with iron determination. To him, the empire's troubles were not merely political or military. They were spiritual. Rome, he believed, had angered the gods who had once favored it. The growing presence of Christians, those who refused to sacrifice to Jupiter or acknowledge the divine genius of the emperor, was, in his eyes, a direct assault on the very foundation of Roman greatness. On February 24, 303 AD, Diocletian struck back. His edict demanded the destruction of churches, the burning of sacred texts, and the arrest of Christian leaders. Every citizen was required to prove loyalty to Rome's gods through sacrifice. Certificates of compliance were issued. Refusal meant loss of property, exile, imprisonment, or death. Emerita Augusta, capital of Lusitania, was not spared. The city's governor, Dacian, enforced the edict with cold efficiency. Altars were erected in public squares. Citizens lined up to offer incense to the gods. Soldiers carried orders to dismantle house churches, and informants prowled the streets, ready to denounce neighbors. Some Christians fled to the countryside, others quietly conformed while holding their faith in secret. And some, a small and stubborn few, prepared to face martyrdom. Among those who watched this unfold was a girl being raised in privilege but also in danger. Eulalia's family was part of the city's elite. Their villa stood among vineyards and olive groves. Outwardly, they conformed to Roman customs, but within their household, the forbidden texts of Christianity were read in hushed voices by lamplight. To protect themselves, her parents taught her both the classics of Homer and Virgil and the Gospels of Christ. From this dual education emerged a child who was as fluent in poetry as she was in prayer, and who seemed destined to challenge the world around her. Even as a child, Eulalia displayed a fierce spirit. When her peers joined festivals honoring Roman gods, she refused. When teachers invoked Jupiter or Mars, she openly mocked them. Warnings fell on deaf ears. For her, faith was not to be hidden but declared. Her parents grew increasingly alarmed. To them, discretion was survival, to her, silence was betrayal. So when Diocletian's edict arrived, the family made a choice. They withdrew to their countryside villa, hoping time and distance would shield their daughter from danger. Surrounded by vineyards, far from the city's watchful eyes, Eulalia could live quietly until the storm passed. But for Eulalia, retreat was not safety, it was cowardice. In her young mind, every moment of comfort in hiding was an abandonment of those who were suffering and dying in the city. The sources say she prayed for days, wrestling with a decision incomprehensible to modern sensibilities, whether to deliberately place herself in the hands of those who would kill her. She fasted, she sang psalms, she demanded of God the strength to confront Rome itself. Then, one night in December, while her household slept, she made her choice. With only a single companion, tradition names her as Julia, perhaps a servant or a fellow believer, she slipped away. The two girls walked for miles through the darkness, their breath visible in the winter air, their sandals striking the frozen ground. By the time the sun rose, they had reached the gates of Emerita Augusta. The city's forum loomed ahead, its columns and temples bathed in pale light. Merchants opened their stalls. Soldiers patrolled with spears in hand. Ordinary citizens went about their business, unaware that history was about to be written in their midst. Into this stage walked Eulalia. What happened next would astonish those who witnessed it, and echo through centuries. She did not wait to be summoned. She did not hide in shadows. She walked straight into the heart of Roman authority, a child facing an empire, her voice prepared to challenge gods and emperor alike. And as she stepped forward, the people whispered. Some laughed, some frowned, but all turned their eyes toward her. 13 years old. 13 steps across the marble stones. And a fire already burning within her that no imperial edict could extinguish. Eulalia was born around the year 290 AD, into a family of privilege and security. Her parents were members of the Hispano-Roman elite, descendants of those who had prospered under Augustus and his successors. Their villa outside Emerita Augusta stood among vineyards and olive groves, a symbol of stability in an age when much of the empire trembled. Within its walls, marble floors reflected the glow of oil lamps, mosaics told stories of mythic gods, and servants moved quietly through the halls. But there was another, more dangerous story told within that household, one whispered in shadows, one passed down in secret. For behind their respectable Roman facade, Eulalia's family were Christians. To survive, they lived a double life. By day, they spoke the language of Virgil and Homer, honoring the traditions of Roman culture. By night, they gathered in hushed voices to read from forbidden texts, the Gospels of Christ, the letters of Paul, stories of martyrs who had already died for their faith. In this way, they sought to protect both their souls and their status. For most children, such a life of contradictions might have bred caution, even fear. But not for Eulalia. From the earliest accounts, she is described as precocious, strong-willed, and disarmingly fearless. While other Christian children were taught to dissemble, to bow their heads quietly at pagan festivals, to pretend when necessary, Eulalia did the opposite. When her peers offered incense to Jupiter, she folded her arms and refused. When teachers invoked Mars as guardian of Rome, she laughed. When neighbors celebrated festivals with sacrifices and wine, she condemned the rituals openly. Her words carried more bite than her small frame suggested. She did not simply decline participation, she challenged it. To the Roman mind, such behavior was scandalous. Religion was not a private matter but the glue of society. Every feast, every ceremony, every sacrifice was tied to Rome's prosperity. A child who mocked the gods was not just eccentric, she was dangerous. People whispered that her family should rein her in, that her insolence could bring ruin not only on herself but on everyone connected to her. Her parents knew this too well. They pleaded with her to temper her zeal, to keep her faith within the safe confines of prayer and charity. They encouraged her to serve the poor, to care for the sick, to channel her fervor into good works that would not draw the governor's eye. They reminded her that even Scripture counseled prudence. Yet, for Eulalia, prudence looked too much like cowardice. The poet Prudentius, writing a century later, captured something of her character, a child both innocent and unyielding, with a fire in her spirit that refused compromise. According to his account, she was not content to live quietly in her faith, she demanded to live it publicly, regardless of cost. In her young mind, to deny Christ in action was to betray him outright. This zeal frightened her parents more than any Roman soldier could. They had seen what happened to outspoken believers. Arrests, property seizures, torture, execution, none of these were abstract possibilities but daily realities since Diocletian's decree. If discovered, their entire household could be ruined. To protect the family, they sought to shelter their daughter. Thus, when the persecution reached Emerita Augusta in the spring of 303, her parents made their decision. They would remove her from danger. The family retreated to their villa in the countryside, away from the watchful eyes of officials and informants. There, among the quiet fields and orchards, they believed she could wait safely until the storm of violence passed. Rome had seen persecutions before, surely this one, too, would fade with time. But for Eulalia, the villa was no refuge. It was a prison. Day after day, she watched smoke rise in the distance from the city where churches were burned and sacred texts thrown into flames. Rumors drifted to the countryside, friends dragged to court, neighbors forced to sacrifice, leaders chained and beaten. To her, every moment of silence was complicity. The girl who had once mocked Jupiter at school now mocked her parents' caution. How could they stay hidden in comfort while others suffered? How could they dine on olives and bread while fellow believers were flogged in the Forum? To Eulalia, their retreat was betrayal. She began fasting, spending long hours in prayer. Servants whispered that she knelt until her knees bruised, that she wept through the night, begging God for strength. She imagined herself not as a victim but as a witness. Martyrdom, in her mind, was not tragedy, it was triumph. The stories she had heard of earlier martyrs burned in her memory. Men and women who refused to yield, who faced beasts in the arena or flames at the stake, who sang hymns even as they were torn apart. To her, these were not tales of horror but of glory. And she longed to join them. This longing was incomprehensible to her parents, who pleaded with her to value her life, to think of their family, to wait for better times. They promised her freedom of faith within the safety of their walls. But their words only deepened her resolve. To live quietly in hiding felt like a slow death, to die openly for Christ felt like true life. In the modern world, it is difficult to imagine a child so young choosing death. We prize childhood as a time of innocence and protection. Yet in Eulalia's world, childhood was brief, and moral choices were thrust upon the young as swiftly as upon their elders. At 13, she was considered nearly a woman, old enough for marriage, old enough to bear responsibility, old enough, at least in her mind, to die for what she believed. Tradition tells us she wrestled with the decision for days. Each sunrise brought her closer to action. Finally, one night in December 304, her choice was made. As her parents and household slept, she slipped quietly from the villa. At her side was Julia, a girl of uncertain identity, perhaps a servant, perhaps a fellow Christian, perhaps simply a companion willing to follow her into the unknown. Together, under the cold stars of Hispania, they began the walk back to Emerita Augusta. Each mile brought them nearer to the heart of Roman power, nearer to the tribunal of the governor who held the power of life and death. For Julia, the journey must have been one of fear. For Eulalia, it was one of liberation. Every step was a rejection of compromise, every stride a declaration that she would not remain silent. By dawn, the city's gates came into view, framed against the rising sun. The marble columns of the Forum glowed faintly in the morning light. The streets filled with merchants, soldiers, and officials who had no idea that history was about to unfold before their eyes. Eulalia had left behind her parents, her home, her safety. What she carried instead was conviction, unyielding, absolute, and more dangerous to Rome than any weapon. The stage was set. The empire had its laws. The governor had his orders. And now, a 13-year-old girl had arrived to challenge them all. The sun had only just begun to rise when the two girls stepped into the heart of Emerita Augusta. The Forum, paved with marble and framed by grand columns, was already alive with movement. Merchants arranged their wares beneath awnings, magistrates in white togas bustled toward their duties, and soldiers patrolled with spears flashing in the dawn light. Yet all of this ordinary rhythm faltered as whispers spread. Two young girls had entered the square, one of them stepping boldly toward the governor's tribunal. Eulalia stood out not because of her wealth or dress, her wool tunic was plain, her feet bare against the cold stones, but because of her expression. At 13, she had the solemnity of someone who carried more than a child's burden. Her eyes, wide and dark, burned with a conviction that unsettled those who looked too closely. The tribunal of Governor Dacian loomed ahead. Carved in stone and draped with crimson banners, it was the stage upon which imperial authority was displayed. Here, edicts were proclaimed, sacrifices offered, and justice, Rome's justice, delivered. On this day, however, its order was about to be disrupted by the smallest of challengers. Without hesitation, Eulalia stepped forward. Soldiers moved instinctively to block her path, but she raised her voice before they could act. Her words, high and clear, carried across the square. Your gods are demons. Your temples are houses of lies. And your emperor, he is no lord, but a servant of darkness. Gasps rippled through the crowd. At first, some laughed nervously, thinking it a child's prank. But as she continued, their laughter died. There was nothing playful in her tone, nothing naive. She spoke as though she were delivering judgment, not seeking mercy. She mocked Jupiter, calling him not the father of gods but an adulterer and a tyrant. She scorned the cult of the emperor, declaring it the height of human arrogance. She condemned the sacrifices performed in the square, insisting that they were empty rituals offered to idols with no power. Each word was a blade cutting against the very fabric of Roman order. Governor Dacian, seated on his tribunal, watched with a mixture of astonishment and unease. He had seen zealots before, men hardened by years of doctrine, women who had lost children and clung to faith as their only solace. But never a girl of 13. He expected fear, trembling, perhaps even tears. Instead, he saw defiance more absolute than any he had encountered. For a moment, he tried reason. "Child," he said, his voice heavy with authority, "you are young. Life is before you. Why throw it away? Offer a pinch of incense. Say the words, and I will forgive you. You may return to your family, marry into nobility, live in honor and wealth. Do not squander your years for a stubborn whim." His offer was genuine, even strategic. Executing a child from a prominent household was not a decision to be made lightly. Martyrs inspired more resistance than they eliminated. If he could coax her into compliance, if only by pretense, he might avoid turning her into a symbol. But Eulalia did not bend. In full view of soldiers, magistrates, and citizens, she strode toward the altar set in the square. Upon it lay incense and an image of the emperor. Dacian leaned forward, perhaps thinking she was about to comply. Instead, she struck. With a swift motion, she knocked over the altar, the incense scattering across the stones. Then, to the shock of all, she spat upon the image of the emperor, her gesture one of absolute rejection. A stunned silence fell over the forum. The soldiers froze. The crowd stood motionless, caught between awe and terror. They understood what this meant. Under Roman law, her act was not merely defiance, it was sacrilege, treason against the state and the gods. It demanded punishment, swift and severe. Yet even then, Dacian hesitated. His mind raced. To execute her immediately would satisfy the law but risk creating a martyr whose story would ignite faith rather than extinguish it. To show leniency would undermine imperial authority, encouraging others to follow her example. He needed another way. "Take her," he ordered finally. Soldiers seized Eulalia, their armored hands engulfing her small frame. Chains were fastened around her wrists, cold against her skin. She was led away, not to execution but to prison. Dacian hoped that a night in the darkness would break her resolve. Perhaps hunger, cold, and isolation would succeed where persuasion had failed. Perhaps her parents, desperate to save her, would intervene with bribes or influence. The prison of Emerita Augusta was a foul place, an underground chamber thick with the stench of sweat, fear, and decay. Rats scurried through straw. The groans of other prisoners echoed in the dark. Yet Eulalia did not cower. She prayed aloud, her voice rising like a hymn against the stone walls. Other captives listened in silence, some comforted, others unsettled. Even the guards, hardened men accustomed to cruelty, shifted uneasily at the sound of her unwavering song. That night, the city buzzed with rumor. Word spread quickly, a child had defied the governor, insulted the gods, and spat upon the emperor's image. By morning, crowds would gather at the forum to see what would become of her. Some came for spectacle, eager for entertainment. Others came in sorrow, knowing they were witnessing the birth of a martyr. Dacian faced a crisis. If he released her, he would appear weak. If he executed her, he risked inspiring resistance. And yet, he had little choice. The empire demanded conformity, and Eulalia had torn conformity to shreds in full public view. By sunrise, soldiers marched her once again into the forum. Her chains clinked with every step, but her face was calm. The people watched as she took her place before the governor, her eyes fixed on him with a gaze too steady for her age. This was no longer a matter of law or even religion. It was a contest of wills, one child against the empire, one fragile body against the machinery of Roman power. And as Dacian prepared to deliver his judgment, the crowd leaned forward, waiting to see whether the empire would triumph, or whether the defiance of a child would prove stronger than the might of Rome itself. The night Eulalia spent in the prison of Emerita Augusta was meant to crush her spirit. The cell was a narrow chamber carved into the earth, its air thick with rot and human waste. Shackles clinked as other prisoners shifted in the dark, their faces pale in the faint torchlight that seeped through the barred entrance. Rats darted between piles of straw. The stench of fear was everywhere. For most, this place meant despair. But for Eulalia, it became a sanctuary of resolve. Witnesses later claimed that she prayed without ceasing, her small voice carrying through the chamber like a hymn against the silence. She sang psalms, she recited words of hope, she reminded herself and others that life in Christ was eternal and suffering temporary. Some prisoners, hardened by weeks of chains, wept quietly as they listened. Even the guards, seasoned men who had heard every curse and plea imaginable, found themselves unsettled by her calm defiance. By morning, word had spread throughout the city. A girl had mocked the gods, spat upon the emperor's image, and spent the night unbroken in chains. The forum filled with citizens eager to witness what would come next. Some came with grim curiosity, others with pity, and still others with admiration they dared not voice aloud. Governor Dacian faced a dilemma. To release her would humiliate imperial authority. To kill her risked creating the very martyr he hoped to avoid. And yet, with the forum filled, with whispers swirling through the city, he could no longer delay. The edict demanded punishment. Eulalia was led once more into the square, chains clinking as she walked. The crowd parted. Some gasped at the sight of her youth, barely taller than the soldiers who surrounded her, her wrists raw from shackles, her hair unkempt yet her face composed. She did not look broken. She looked resolved. Dacian rose from his tribunal. His voice boomed. "Child, the gods are merciful. Offer incense and you shall live. Deny them, and you will suffer every torment until you repent." Eulalia's reply was steady, though her voice was young. "I will not sacrifice to your demons. I will not betray the one true God. Do what you must." So it began. The first torment. She was stripped of her tunic and lashed with whips of leather until her skin welts rose red. Each blow struck like thunder. The crowd flinched. A grown man could have died from such flogging, yet Eulalia endured, her lips moving in prayer. The second. Whips tipped with metal tore into her flesh. Strips of skin fell away, blood staining the marble floor. Yet she did not scream. Witnesses said she began to sing, her voice faint but clear, words of a hymn rising above the soldiers' grunts. The third. Hooks of iron raked across her sides, dragging strips of muscle from her body. This was a punishment reserved for traitors. The forum echoed with gasps. Some women in the crowd turned away, unable to watch. Yet Eulalia looked skyward, murmuring, "Lord, receive my spirit." The fourth. Torches were pressed against her open wounds. The smell of burning flesh filled the air. Soldiers, expecting cries of agony, heard instead words of defiance. "Is this the power of your gods? Then they are weak indeed." The fifth and sixth. Oil was poured over her back, then set alight. Her body convulsed as flames licked her skin, but she stood upright, as though rooted in something deeper than pain. Molten lead followed, poured upon her wounds. Even hardened soldiers trembled at the sight. The seventh. Her hair was torn by the fistful, scalp bleeding, yet she continued to whisper prayers. The eighth and ninth. Spikes were driven beneath her nails, and she was dragged across shards of pottery, leaving streaks of blood across the forum floor. Still, she refused to recant. The 10th. Her body was stretched upon the rack, joints cracking under strain. Dacian leaned forward, waiting for her to beg for mercy. Instead, she said softly, "You can break my body, but not my soul." The 11th. Boiling water was splashed upon her, scalding her already wounded flesh. The 12th. She was branded with hot irons, her skin searing, smoke rising from her arms. The 13th. Finally, she was suspended upon a cross-like frame, left to hang as soldiers mocked her faith. Yet even then, her lips moved in prayer, her voice faint but unyielding. The crowd, once curious for spectacle, grew silent. Murmurs turned to sobs. Some covered their faces. Others whispered that she was already more than mortal, that no child could endure such torment without divine strength. Dacian's frustration mounted. Each new punishment meant to break her only magnified her defiance. What was meant as a warning to others was becoming a spectacle of courage. The people were not seeing imperial power, they were seeing a child stronger than the empire itself. At last, there was a pause. The torturers stepped back, exhausted. Dacian's voice cut through the air, edged with both anger and desperation. "Recant, child. Deny your God and live. Why throw away your life so senselessly?" Eulalia lifted her head, her face bloodied, her body broken, yet her words carried across the forum. "My life is not mine to keep, but his. You have no power but what is given you. I fear nothing you can do." Those words sealed her fate. Dacian had tried persuasion, promises, torture, nothing worked. The law demanded an end. He would burn her, making her death a spectacle of terror. But for those who watched, terror had already been transformed into something else. They saw not a victim but a conqueror. Not a child destroyed, but a child defying the empire to the very end. The 13th torment was complete. All that remained was the fire. By the time the last torment ended, the forum of Emerita Augusta had fallen into a heavy silence. What was meant to be a public lesson in obedience had become something else entirely. Instead of cowering before the empire's power, the people had seen a child resist with unyielding faith. Soldiers looked away from her battered body, ashamed to meet her gaze. Women wept openly. Even hardened officials shifted uneasily, whispering that this was no ordinary trial. Governor Dacian, however, could not afford hesitation. The empire demanded order. Its laws demanded conformity. And Eulalia had shattered both. Every moment she lived, she was an indictment of Roman authority. She had to be silenced completely, not by persuasion, not by torture, but by death, swift, final, absolute. He gave the order, she would be burned alive, in the forum itself, as an example to all. Soldiers moved quickly to construct the pyre. Timber was stacked high, soaked in oil to ensure a swift blaze. The crowd, pressed close against the edges of the square, murmured in dread. Many had expected a flogging, perhaps even a beheading. But fire, the ultimate punishment reserved for slaves and traitors, was another matter. To apply it to a girl of 13 was almost unthinkable. Eulalia was led to the center. Chains clinked as they bound her to the wooden post, her small body dwarfed by the towering pyre around her. Her tunic, already torn and burned in places, clung to her wounded skin. Yet her face was serene. She looked not at her executioners, not at the crowd, but upward, as though the heavens themselves were waiting. A hush fell. Then the torches were lowered. Flames licked the wood, crackling, rising. Smoke billowed upward, dark against the pale morning sky. The heat surged, waves of fire curling around her. Witnesses later spoke of what happened next, though their accounts differ in detail. Some said Eulalia cried out, not in pain, but in praise, her voice rising above the roar of the fire. Others claimed she stood silently, lips moving in prayer until her final breath. But all accounts agree on one thing, a sign appeared. As the flames consumed her, a white dove burst from her mouth, soaring upward into the sky. Its wings caught the light, glowing against the smoke, a symbol of the soul freed from flesh. The crowd gasped. Some fell to their knees. To the Romans, it was inexplicable; to Christians, it was proof of the divine. Then, as if nature itself joined in protest, snow began to fall. From a sky that had been clear moments before, flakes drifted down, soft and silent, covering the charred body in a white shroud. Fire and snow, death and purity, destruction and renewal, met in a single moment. The forum erupted. Some cried aloud that it was a miracle. Others turned away, unable to reconcile what they had seen. Soldiers, hardened to cruelty, stared at the ground. Even Dacian, it was said, looked shaken, though his face quickly hardened again. When the flames died, what remained was not triumph for Rome but a symbol for faith. Eulalia's body, blackened and broken, lay covered in snow, a contrast too stark to be forgotten. That night, under cover of darkness, Christians of Emerita Augusta came to the forum. Risking their own lives, they gathered her remains, wrapping them carefully, and carried them away for burial. They knew the danger; they could be arrested, tortured, killed. But they also knew they were tending not to a corpse but to the relics of a saint. In the days that followed, her grave became a place of pilgrimage. Believers left flowers, whispered prayers, lit candles. Soldiers tried to prevent it, but the more they suppressed, the more devotion grew. Stories spread beyond the city, carried by travelers and merchants. From Lusitania to Gaul, from Hispania to Africa, the tale of a child martyred for her faith stirred hearts and inspired courage. For Dacian, the official report likely spoke of a successful execution. The edict had been enforced, a troublemaker eliminated, order restored. But he could not erase what the people had seen: a girl who mocked the empire's gods, endured its tortures, and died in flames without breaking. Instead of silencing faith, her death amplified it. Within weeks, her name was spoken with reverence in Christian gatherings. Within months, hymns were composed in her honor. Within years, basilicas would rise over her tomb, and her feast day would be celebrated. What Rome intended as annihilation had become consecration. To the empire, Eulalia was a criminal. To history, she became something else entirely, a saint. The image that endured was not her broken body, not the flames that consumed her, but the dove ascending into the sky. A symbol that suffering could be transformed, that even innocence destroyed could become innocence triumphant. Rome had sought to crush a child. Instead, it had unleashed a legend that would outlast its gods, its temples, and even its emperors. When the fire had finally died down in the forum of Emerita Augusta, what remained was more than ash and charred timber. For those who had gathered, soldiers, citizens, and secret Christians alike, the memory of that morning lingered like smoke in the lungs. A girl of 13 had faced the full might of Rome, endured torture and flame, and yet left behind not despair but a symbol that would outlast the empire itself. That very night, under the cover of darkness, Christians crept into the square. Risking arrest, they collected her remains with trembling hands. They wrapped what little was left of her body, still covered in the strange snow that had fallen from a clear sky, and carried it away. They buried her quietly, knowing her grave would not remain unknown for long. The seed of a cult, a community of veneration, had been planted. In the days that followed, something remarkable happened. Far from frightening the Christians of Emerita Augusta into silence, Eulalia's death emboldened them. They whispered her name in prayer. They told and retold the story of her defiance, each version adding new color: the dove rising from her mouth, the snow covering her wounds, the serenity on her face as the flames consumed her. These details, whether historical or legendary, carried a truth deeper than fact. They gave meaning to suffering. They turned a child's brutal death into a victory. Soon, pilgrims came to her grave. Some left flowers, others fragments of cloth or oil lamps, tokens of reverence. Roman authorities tried to suppress this devotion, but the more they forbade, the more it spread. Within months, the story of Eulalia traveled beyond Lusitania. Traders and travelers carried it to Gaul, to Africa, even to Rome itself. In an age without printing presses or mass communication, her tale spread with astonishing speed, proof of how powerfully it resonated in communities under the shadow of persecution. By the mid-4th century, less than a decade after her death, the empire itself began to change. Constantine's Edict of Milan in 313 legalized Christianity, and suddenly the faith once condemned was permitted to flourish. Within 2 generations, the gods for whom Eulalia had been tortured would be abandoned, their temples left to ruin or converted into churches. The empire that had killed her would itself kneel before the cross. In this new Christian world, Eulalia's memory became more than local. She was canonized in the collective imagination of believers. Prudentius, the great Christian poet of Hispania, wrote hymns in her honor in the late 4th century. His verses ensured her story would be sung in churches for centuries, shaping how generations understood courage, innocence, and the cost of faith. Basilicas rose over her burial site in Mérida, transforming it into one of the most important centers of pilgrimage in Hispania. Pilgrims flocked to her shrine, seeking healing, strength, and courage. They touched the stone said to have felt the heat of her pyre. They prayed beside the relics of the child who had defied an empire. As her cult spread, Eulalia's image evolved. In early art, she was depicted not as a child but as a crowned woman, triumphant and serene. The Church wanted to present her not as a broken victim but as a victorious saint. But as centuries passed, depictions became more visceral. In Gothic art, she appeared young and fragile, her body marked with wounds, her expression filled with both suffering and peace. By the Baroque era, artists painted her in brutal detail, bloodied, burned, tears on her cheeks, designed to stir the deepest emotions of the faithful. Each generation found something new in her story. To persecuted Christians under Islam in medieval Spain, she was a mirror of their struggle. To young women, she became a model of purity and strength, one who refused to submit to marriage or worldly authority. To theologians, she embodied the paradox of suffering turned into triumph, weakness turned into strength. Even crusaders invoked her name before battle, seeing in her defiance of Rome a precedent for their own fight. But beyond the embellishments and shifting interpretations, the essence of her story remained unchanged, a child who refused to bow to power, who chose death over compromise, who showed that even the smallest voice could shake an empire. Modern historians debate the details. Was every torment real, or were some later inventions? Did a dove truly rise from her mouth, did snow truly fall? Perhaps not. Archaeological evidence confirms the site of her veneration, but not the miraculous details. And yet, to reduce her story only to what can be proved is to miss its power. The miracles, real or imagined, capture how people experienced her death, how they processed the trauma of watching innocence destroyed, and how they found hope in what seemed hopeless. In the 20th century, scholars began reading her story through new lenses. Feminist historians pointed out the significance of a young girl defying not just Rome but the patriarchal expectations of her family and society. She rejected the roles of wife and mother, embracing instead a radical spiritual independence. Psychologists asked unsettling questions: what does it mean for a child to seek death? Was she indoctrinated, or did she truly understand her choice? The answers are complex, but the questions themselves show the enduring relevance of her tale. Even today, her name is remembered. In Mérida, her feast day on December 10th is still celebrated with processions and prayers. The city, modern yet ancient, acknowledges her as part of its identity. Tourists visit her basilica, walking on stones worn smooth by centuries of pilgrims. Her story continues to raise questions that transcend religion: what values are worth dying for? How do societies treat the vulnerable in times of crisis? How do communities turn trauma into meaning? The last image that lingers is not of her suffering, but of the dove rising from the flames. Whether literal or symbolic, it speaks to something universal: the human need to find transcendence in tragedy, to believe that innocence can become triumph, that even in the darkest moment, something pure can rise. Rome is gone. Its emperors forgotten, its gods abandoned. But the child it tried to silence is remembered still. Eulalia of Mérida, 13 years old, burned in a forum, her ashes carried by the faithful, remains a voice that whispers across the centuries, power may crush the body, but it cannot conquer the spirit.